What's up everyone, welcome back to another video. Today we're working on a Cressida. So, a lot of you might recognize this car, some of you may not. But anyway, this is Todd's Cressida. You might remember, probably earlier this year I think I released it. I built Todd a new bottom end for this thing. So, Todd went through a couple of stock bottom end cars. The last stock bottom end he had, it let go of a rod. It was making 720 wheel horsepower on stock bottom end. Or I say wheel, but horsepower at the hubs, on the hub dyno. And it blew a rod out of the block. So at that point, Todd decided to go for a built motor, but obviously he has a fair bit of mechanical understanding and knowledge, but he didn't really want to take on assembling a big expensive built engine himself. So he decided to get us just to pretty much essentially just build him a bottom end. And the deal was that we would build him a bottom end, take care of all the machine work, get it assembled, blueprinted and everything else, give that back to him, and from there he would take the wheel and finish off the car. So that happened earlier in the year. Todd slowly worked at getting this thing together, got himself a new Hypertune intake manifold. He's got himself a new, well not new to him, GT4294 it is. So new hot side, new cold side, like the thing is pretty much a brand new combo. He got it all together and the story goes as follows. I didn't make content on this at the time because it was only here for a very short period. It was going to be a pretty boring video, but this was getting taken care of tuning wise by Rob from Definition Motorsports on the Godzilla Motorsports hub dyno. It's a mainline hub. So Todd took it to the dyno to get run in and then tuned. So what I did was essentially built him a bottom end. All I did with the head was put the cams in it to measure the shims so that I could give him the sizes for the shimless buckets that he ended up deciding to go. At the time he didn't know if he was going to go shimless buckets or shims, so I just took the measurements so that I knew what he'd need, gave it to him and sort of just gave him the measurements of which way to go. He ended up going shimless buckets and he could buy all them and put it all together when he put the head on. So that's how I gave him back the combo. He finished it all off. Rob from Definition Motorsports ran it in. After they ran it in, they dropped the oil, and the oil was full of pretty big chunks. Like, it was pretty chunky stuff in there, and it was quite big chunks of metal that weren't magnetic. So it wasn't ferrous, but the bits were too big to be any sort of soft metal from any bearings. So it sort of raised alarm bells for Rob and Todd. For me, it's fairly obvious that it wasn't bearing metal because it was way too big to be any sort of soft metal, and it wasn't magnetic. So Todd bought it straight out here from Rob so that we could have a look over it, because Todd had to go back to work and he wasn't going to get time to pretty much get it sorted. At this point we were 3 weeks out from Matsuri, so it was a big rush job at that point to try and get the thing sorted, back to the dyno and tuned, ready for Matsuri so Todd could drive. What I found was, as soon as I got out here, I had a bit of a hunch that I knew what was going on, and that was that I didn't think Todd had probably cleaned the head properly before it went on, and that's probably partly my fault. I sort of never ran that by Todd. I had this hunch that probably Todd had just whacked the head on the engine and not cleaned it out, and I figured if I dumped the coolant or the water at that point out of the engine and it had all the same sort of swarf and filings in it, that would probably be the case, because if that was the case, then it would be in the water ports and jackets on the head as well as the oil. And sure enough, I dumped the water out of the thing and it was the same things. Really big chunks of metal that wasn't magnetic and wasn't ferrous, which is pretty typical of obviously an aluminium head that's just been machined. You know, you've got the milling machine which mills the surface flat. You end up with aluminium swarf everywhere. It's if you don't wash it out, it's going to end up in the oil and in the water. So that's what it was. Apart from that, it was just making a bit of a noise, what sounded like almost a lifter noise, which Todd talked to quite a few people who have built J's with this sort of intake manifold. It's a big sheet alloy intake manifold. It echoes a lot of noise. We sort of just chalked it down to the fact that that it was probably just new noise from having shimless bucklets in a combination of this new sheet alloy intake manifold. So that was what that was chalked down to. I pretty much told Todd to just flush the engine oil out a few times before it goes back to the dyno, and you know, at that point, fingers crossed, it was going to be all good. From there, there's not a lot much else you could do about it. It's like one of those things, either at that point do you pull the motor, completely strip it and clean it out and put it all back together and hope that you can get it all done by Matsuri. At that point we were flat out, as we are now, so we didn't really have time to do that sort of thing for him. So it was one of those things, do you do it now or do you do it later sort of deal. So we were hoping that it would be all right. So it went back to the dyno, everything was fine. The thing made just over 900 horsepower at the hub and Todd was stoked. So it went from dyno, it went to Matsuri. Todd had a mostly trouble-free weekend. He just about hardly had to touch it with a spanner at all. I'm pretty sure he might have not even had to touch it with a spanner at all. Just absolutely slayed tyres all weekend, had a ball of a time. It's the first time he's really driven the car in like over a year, so he was stoked with it. That was awesome. He took it home from Matsuri on the trailer, unloaded it, and just started pretty much street driving it everywhere. Drove it out for dinner that night. He's been driving it to and from work. So he lives Gold Coast area and works in Gympie, so I think he does that drive maybe once or twice a week, I'm not sure. So he was driving this thing up and down. It's done, he said, something like 640k since he serviced it after Matsuri. So it's been driving around on the street quite a bit. So the story goes, he drove it the other morning from home to work in Gympie. This thing has always made heaps of oil pressure. By the time he got to Gympie, it was making like a worryingly low amount of oil pressure. So we sort of just decided that, you know, it was low oil pressure, but it was still making oil pressure. So we sort of just decided to try and limp it home, change the oil, sort of assess what was going on in the oil and everything else, and sort of make an assessment off that. But before Todd even drove it home, he drove it to the servo to fuel it up, and the oil pressure was just getting worse, and it was starting to make some noises and stuff. So he just decided to call it, and he just got it towed here, and this is how it is. So here we are with this engine that's 900 horsepower, pretty well fresh built, and it went from doing a whole weekend of slaying tyres at Matsuri, a fair bit of street driving and everything, to obviously being pretty unhealthy in a very short amount of time. So it's one of those things where we're going to have to just start pulling it apart and see what we can find, see what's gone wrong, which is why I thought I'd make a video, because I feel like everyone can learn something when things like this go wrong. So obviously we'll start off just pulling it apart. If it comes down to it's something that we have done, happy to cop it on the chin, no issues with that. But at the way that it sort of performed for an entire weekend of track work, and then did a lot of street driving, and then suddenly started having issues, let's pull it apart and see what we can find out when we start pulling it down. So sorry for the long drawn out intro, guys, but it's probably a lot of pretty important information to know as we move forward with what's going on here. But I'll just show you around this car. It's freaking awesome. So as you can see, Garrett GT 4294 on a, okay, I don't even know what his actual hot side manifold is, but I know Basic Speed Shop did all of the fab work for the dump and stuff. As you can see, he's got like Wiggins clamps on the intake, Hypertune intake manifold. Like, the thing is pretty awesome. It's pretty nuts. So runs dedicated E85, still running the Haltech Elite 750. As you can see, it's a pretty sick Cressida sunroof model, blue suede Series 1 interior. It's got the S1 sequential shifter because it's a T56. It's a GM T56 box, so it's a pretty gangster car. It's pretty sick. Got the Haltech IQ3 as well. So pretty awesome car. I'm a big fan of it. So keen to get this sorted and get Todd back to motoring, doing what he wants to do. All right, guys. So immediate findings just from getting it into the shed and getting it up on the hoist. Moving it into the shed, we've noticed that there is a mad E85 leak from the rear of the car around the fuel tank area. So along with that, the actual fuel pressure gauge that he's got, Todd has a distribution block set up on the firewall, which has his oil pressure, fuel pressure, everything going to the distribution block. And there's a fuel pressure gauge in it, which is just screwed. It's not reading right at all. So we've got a fuel leak, fuel pressure gauge not working, and there's no fuel pressure input to the ECU because it is only the Elite 750, so inputs are limited. As well as that, just looking underneath on the intake side, there is oil everywhere, all over everything. It's pretty wild how much oil is up on the underside of that intake manifold. You know, all over the starter here, there is a lot of oil. And you know, the thing is, J's are quite a simple motor, really. The only thing that's really on this side that is, you know, oil and pressure fed is the oil pressure sender location, which is up under here, you can see there. And that's where Todd's taken off his feed for his turbo, as well as this oil line, which goes to his distribution block, which has this oil pressure sensor on it. And there's oil all over that as well. A lot of oil around the place. So before we get too far into removing this, I would like to just sort of run it and have a look at what's going on under here, where we might have oil coming from. There's a lot of oil around the place. It's pretty wild. So that, we'll investigate what the hell's going on with that fuel leak, and we'll put another fuel pressure gauge in the block to see whether the fuel pressure is being affected by that leak as well. All right, so just from quickly running it, it is just piercing out oil out of the little block fitting, which obviously diverts it across to the distribution block up there, and then off to the turbo feed. So that is just pissing out oil all over everywhere, and obviously while he's driving and fans are on and stuff, it's just blowing its way all up underneath the intake manifold and stuff. So found that pretty quick. All right, so we found the leak, and it's nothing to do with the pressure side or anything like that. It's literally just a really dodgy joint in a breather, which I'm not going to show the world, but that's all that is, and it's just because the tank's really full that it's obviously just leaking out the breather. I'm pretty confident that that is definitely not affecting anything to do with pressure. This gauge is screwed, but there's nothing in the system that would make me believe that there's any issue with fuel pressure, so I'm not going to bother with it. So with all that being said, just going to continue on pulling this out, and then I've sort of checked as much as we want to check before it comes out. Alright, so I've just dumped the coolant into this. This drum was clean. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it on camera, but you can see all of the stuff that's in that. I'm not sure how many times Todd flushed the water in this car before he went back to the dyno, but that's sort of what we were dealing with as far as how much was left, I suppose you'd say, in the head. So yeah, I don't know if you'd be able to pick up what's sort of sloshing around right there in the shallow bits. Hopefully you can see it on the camera. Just from looking at the screen on the camera, it looks like there's a fair bit of glare. So, but yeah, there's quite a bit of fairly chunky stuff. Obviously in the water system nothing gets filtered, so you know, it's all to be seen, but there's still quite a bit that came out in the oil. So situations like this are hard, you know. Like I said, for me it seemed blatantly obvious that that would be what you'd do, but for someone who doesn't do it all the time, maybe not so blatantly obvious. I didn't make it clear to Todd that I hadn't yet cleaned the head either. So it's sort of just like a pretty crappy, if this is the problem, it's sort of just like a pretty crappy byproduct of trying to save money and half do things, have one person half do something, one person finish it, and things get lost in translation. It's sort of just a shitty situation, is all it really is. But anyway, we don't even know yet, so we'll start pulling it down. All right guys, back here this morning, just to add on to sort of how I signed off the last little bit as well. It's not even just about the financial point of that. It's also, I suppose, about the pride of being involved in your own car and doing some work yourself sort of thing. So, you know, obviously for a lot of people, these cars, they're a lot more than just cars, and they like to be involved and do as much work as they can themselves. So that was more of the case in this situation as opposed to anything financial. It wasn't really anything like that. It was more so just the fact that, you know, it's Todd's car, it's his pride and joy, it's his baby. I'm sure he really wanted to build his bottom end himself, but wanted to do as much else as he could himself. But anyway, I just wanted to add that on. Just started to undo the starter and stuff and noticed that it's actually missing a bolt out of the starter. So that's all pretty wacky. So that wouldn't have been loving life, no. All right, engine's out. Engine's finally bloody out. So anyway, we'll get it on a stand, and hopefully over the next couple of days we'll get some room in the engine room to get it in there and start having a look. Alrighty guys, we're on the stand, ready to go. Get everything in the car all plugged up so it can go back out undercover now until such a time as I can start hoeing into this engine. So that's going to be it for now. Probably be next week till I can start on this, but we'll pick up there.